Theresa May touches down in the United States to talk trade with Trump. Before their meeting, the president's first with a foreign leader, Mrs. May addresses a Republican conference. She signals a change in UK foreign policy with clear echoes of that of Mr. Trump.
The days of Britain and America intervening in sovereign countries in an attempt to remake the world in our own image are over.
Stepping down for the first time from Air Force One, President Trump looks ahead to his meeting with Mrs. May.
So I'm meeting with her tomorrow. I don't have my Commerce Secretary. They want to talk trade. So I'll have to handle it myself.
But Mr. Trump's comments approving of torture may prove something of a stumbling block among the diplomatic niceties. Also tonight, no post-Brexit slowdown as the UK economy grows faster than expected. Prison suicides at record levels in England and Wales, and a huge increase in attacks on staff.
It's like a soldier on a battlefield. You don't know what you're going to be faced with. And on top of that, you've got the fear. Am I going to make it home tonight?
The Brexit bill is published, causing tension within Labour, which tells its MPs, you must vote for it. And one of the leading contemporary art prizes in the world, won tonight by a British artist and filmmaker.
In the south, as Southampton fans look forward to a trip to Wembley, a Chinese company seeks to buy a stake in the club. And devolution deal dead in the water, but will taxpayers be left counting the cost?
Good evening. Theresa May has arrived in America at the start of a trip which she hopes will pave the way for a post-Brexit trade deal with the United States. She'll be the first foreign leader to hold talks with Donald Trump when she meets the new president at the White House tomorrow. This evening, she addressed a Republican conference in Philadelphia in a speech where she sought to find common ground with Mr. Trump. But the Prime Minister's bid to launch a new era of cooperation with America risked being overshadowed by a row about President Trump's support for torture and, in particular, waterboarding. Our political editor Laura Kuenssberg is travelling with Theresa May and has just sent this report.
Opposites attract. Theresa May's hope, but how close does she want to get to him? The Prime Minister made a quieter arrival, making her way down the windy steps in Philadelphia. Her convoy speeding towards her debut in Trumpland, here to make friends.
No hate, no fear! Trump isn't welcome here!
A reminder right outside the five-star hotel where they were both to speak. Donald Trump has many enemies too. The Prime Minister's warm-up act was the President himself. Is he ready for her?
I'm meeting with the Prime Minister tomorrow, as you know, Great Britain. So I'm meeting with her tomorrow. I don't have my Commerce Secretary. They want to talk trade. So I'll have to handle it myself. Which is okay.
Then it was her turn, with, as you'd expect, fulsome reference to the friendship across the Atlantic.
It has been America's destiny to bear the leadership of the free world and to carry that heavy responsibility on its shoulders. But my country, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, has been proud to share that burden and to walk alongside you at every stage.
But this is much more than a meet and greet. Theresa May came with a serious message for Republicans and the world. Under her leadership, no more Western conflicts like Iraq or Afghanistan, she suggested.
This cannot mean a return to the failed policies of the past. The days of Britain and America intervening in sovereign countries in an attempt to remake the world in our own image are over. But nor can we afford to stand idly by when the threat is real and when it is in our own interests to intervene. We must be strong, smart, and hard-headed, and we must demonstrate the resolve necessary to stand up for our interests.
And a warning, perhaps directed at the President, over an assertive Russia.
When it comes to Russia, As so often, it is wise to turn to the example of President Reagan, who during his negotiations with his opposite number, Mikhail Gorbachev, used to abide by the adage, trust but verify. With President Putin, my advice is to engage, but beware.
Noticeable too, her praise for the Republicans and President Trump's controversial win.
Because of what you have done together, because of that great victory you have won, America can be stronger, greater, and more confident in the years ahead.
Even before she touched down, though, Theresa May had a taste of how much political trouble closeness to President Trump could cause. Number 10 believes the risk is worth it because there's big opportunity too. But this new friendship could cause fireworks every time Donald Trump speaks his mind.
Like suggesting torture, banned under British and international law, works.
I want to do everything within the bounds of what you're allowed to do legally. But do I feel it works? Absolutely, I feel it works.
The Prime Minister was adamant Britain won't change its laws and signalled we might stop sharing intelligence with America if torture was brought back. But here among the Republican top brass, the idea is unlikely to fly.
The deep-seated policy in American culture is not to torture. That is not going to happen.
So Theresa May's right and the President Trump is wrong?
I didn't say that.
Just one of many awkward subjects the PM and the President could discuss tomorrow. A test. Even in politics, true friends tell the truth to one another, not merely platitudes or what they want to hear.
So, Laura, there in Philadelphia tonight, Theresa May clearly trying to set the tone of the relationship she would like the UK to have with Donald Trump.
That's right, Fiona. In the city where American revolutionaries at the time threw off their attachment to the UK and declared independence, Theresa May came here with much more than broad, warm words about the importance of our traditions and our shared history. She came here signalling, for example, a clean break with failed, as she suggested, a foreign policy of the past, interventions that America and Britain had been involved in, clearly signalling what had happened in Iraq and perhaps Afghanistan, where American presidents had taken British prime ministers into conflicts that had worked out badly. Very interesting that she used this big major appearance here to signal such a shift. But more broadly, how does the self-described hard-working vicar's daughter reconcile herself to work with the reality TV star billionaire president? Well, the answer from this speech was with great care and calibration. There were subtle criticisms, warnings, for example, on Russia. But, for example, on NATO, where President Trump has expressed doubts, she said she shared some of those doubts, but insisted that America and Britain must continue to work hard to make sure that NATO still really matters. As ever with Theresa May, no single word was wasted. Everything was in there, carefully put there with meaning behind it. But, you know, tomorrow she is off to the White House and the talks will turn to trade. I have to say the audience here, Republican in Philadelphia tonight, is an easier audience for her to be friends with President Trump than it is back home. And Downing Street is well aware that this relationship is extremely important, but they also know how controversial it could be. It's not so much, Fiona, that she's trying to walk a fine line. It's more like she's having to tiptoe across a tightrope across the whole of the Grand Canyon.
Laura in Philadelphia, thank you. Well, our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins is with me. And James, let's just pick on something that Laura was saying there. You were listening to Mrs May's speech in Philadelphia as well. And one thing that very much stood out was what she appears to be signalling, a change in UK foreign policy.
This is a hugely significant speech. I mean, arguably the biggest by a British Prime Minister in the United States since Tony Blair's in Chicago 18 years ago in 1999, when he first openly advocated armed interventionism against dictators. And of course, that was repudiated by Theresa May this evening. But as if to underscore the failure of current British foreign policy, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, earlier on today told a committee of the House of Lords that now the policy in Britain had changed and that President Assad should be permitted to run for election as part of a democratic resolution of the Syrian civil war. That's a complete reversal of British foreign policy. Boris Johnson himself called it a complete flip-flop but he said the UK had been unable at any stage to fulfil its mantra that the Syrian president should go. Now, by Boris Johnson saying it meant Theresa May didn't have to, but those are pretty painful words to have to utter. There's obviously much more in the Prime Minister's speech that we've been listening to. She's challenging Donald Trump, particularly over NATO and the UN, and I think she's signalling it's going to be a bumpy special relationship.
We shall see. James, thank you very much. Well, meanwhile, President Trump had other things on his mind than his meeting with Mrs. May. Relations between the US and Mexico have soured still further. Following a tweet from Mr. Trump suggesting their meeting next week should be scrapped, the Mexican president retaliated by cancelling it. The row centres on President Trump's plans to build a wall along the Mexican border and his repeated insistence that Mexico will pay for it. Our North America correspondent Nick Bryant reports.
Donald Trump's new executive toy, his first ride today on Air Force One, that potent symbol of US presidential power. But it was the cancelled travel plans of the Mexican president that were at the centre of a diplomatic storm. His plane will stay grounded after a summit between the two leaders scheduled for Washington next week was abruptly called off. This Mexican standoff is over the great totem of the Trump presidency, the wall he's determined not just to build along the border, but also to get Mexico to pay for.
México no pagará ningún muro.
But in an angry speech last night, the country's president, Enrique Peña Nieto, said he wouldn't foot the bill. So shortly before leaving the Oval Office this morning, Donald Trump decided to conduct his diplomacy by tweet. If Mexico is unwilling to pay for the badly needed wall, then it would be better to cancel the upcoming meeting. By the time he spoke in Philadelphia, the Mexicans had announced the summit was off, and that earned a public scolding from President Trump.
The President of Mexico and myself have agreed to cancel our planned meeting scheduled for next week. Unless Mexico is going to treat the United States fairly, with respect, such a meeting would be fruitless, and I want to go a different route.
Almost a week into his term in office, it's already becoming clear that Donald Trump is changing the presidency more than the presidency is changing him. On primetime TV last night, the former property tycoon gave a tour of the country's most prized piece of real estate, and it was vintage Donald Trump.
I don't want to change too much. I can be the most presidential person ever, other than possibly the great Abe Lincoln, all right? But I can be the most presidential person.
He's still obsessed with the crowd size at his inauguration.
Oh, a sea of love.
But in a new interview with Fox News, he turned his attention to the group calling itself Islamic State, saying its fighters were sick and demented.
The people that we're going against, they don't wear uniforms. They're sneaky, dirty rats. And they blow people up in a shopping center. And they blow people up in a church. These are bad people.
The presidency is travelling at a hurtling pace. The late-breaking news tonight that he's now calling for a 20% tax on Mexican imports to pay for the wall. Donald Trump is clearly reveling in his seat of power, whether it's in the Oval Office or at 30,000 feet.
Beautiful. Great plane.
Nick Bryant, BBC News, Washington.
Let's talk to our North America editor, John Sopel, who's at the White House now. John, it's difficult in a sense to keep up with events in Washington. I mean, Nick was referring there to this tax with Mexico. Donald Trump is firing off one executive order after another, and then he's picking fights like that with Mexico.
There are the announcements that they have anticipated and planned for, and there is what they call in the White House stray voltage, where things haven't gone quite exactly to plan, and there's been a lot of that today. So you've had the top team at the State Department, civil servants resigning en masse. You have had all manner of other things as well. The row over torture, with the Republican leadership's distancing themselves from him. You've had the concern over him signing an executive order looking into electoral fraud, even though the evidence is very scant on that. And indeed, so much so that apparently one of the reasons Donald Trump believes it, he was told it was so by the German golfer Bernhard Langer. These are some of the things that are kind of moving Donald Trump in a certain direction. And on top of that, of course, we've had the Mexican president announcing that he is not going to come to Washington after all. There seem to be limits on Twitter diplomacy.
Well, let's talk about this meeting with Theresa May tomorrow. What reception is she likely to get there?
I think she's going to get a very warm reception. I thought what was notable about her speech was how loudly she proclaimed her closeness and was very subtle about the differences, as Laura was saying, that she has with this administration. But this is all about trade and getting a deal if and when Britain leaves the single market, which seems to be kind of coming more and more certain. The thing you have to ask is, who needs that trade deal more, Donald Trump or Theresa May? Theresa May is clearly the answer to that question, which means that she is going to have to tread very carefully with Donald Trump, who may be offering her all sorts of nice things, but there may be traps in there as well.
John Sopel at the White House, thank you. Well, here in the UK, strong consumer spending helped the economy grow faster than expected at the end of last year. Figures show it grew by 0.6% in the October to December period. It means the British economy expanded by 2% last year, confounding predictions from some economists that there would be an immediate slowdown after the Brexit vote. The Chancellor Philip Hammond said the figures show the economy is robust, but warned there could be a period of uncertainty ahead, as our economics editor Kamal Ahmed reports.
It was Napoleon who famously and sarcastically called us a nation of shopkeepers. And the government will be pleased today the UK economy is still one based on consumers and the high street. Britain's services sector, 80% of the economy, was the reason for the positive growth figures. For shoppers in Reading, it was good business as usual.
A lot of people thought that the referendum voting to leave the European Union would mean that consumers might be a bit nervous, what's the future hold, would stop spending. Did you find that was true at all?
No, not at all. I haven't seen any difference, personally.
I think consumer spending will maintain itself, and say long term I think we're in for a good ride.
I think we're in a terribly unstable situation. I really do. We've got nothing that's filling us with confidence.
Instability, lack of confidence, they drove a myriad of warnings before the referendum.
There would be a hit to the value of people's homes of at least 10% and up to 18%.
Material slowdown in growth, notable increase in inflation.
Higher prices, less growth means less jobs, so higher unemployment.
We are indeed a nation of shoppers. And frankly, those gloomy predictions before the referendum haven't come to pass. Consumer confidence is still strong, business confidence is still strong. But with inflation rising and Britain actually still to start the process of leaving the European Union, which of course we haven't done yet, will that confidence remain?
The Chancellor meeting apprentices at Microsoft near Reading, a company that is investing in the UK. I met him later and asked him about the Bank of England forecast, which said growth could slow next year.
Is this economic pain cancelled, or is it economic pain delayed?
Well, what the figures today show is that the UK economy continues to be resilient and continues to confound the sceptics. Of course, we recognise that as we go into this period of negotiation with the European Union, and as we absorb the impacts of the depreciation of sterling last year, there will be more uncertainty ahead during the course of this year.
British-built cars off to the continent today, a mark of optimism as production reached a 17-year high and exports hit a record. There is still, though, that Brexit shadow.
Anecdotally, we are getting comments from a number of our members say that effectively they're sitting on their hands. They're waiting to see what the future is going to hold and looking for that greater certainty about the future relationship, especially with Europe.
The nation of shoppers forges on. Britain's growth last year was the highest of any of the major Western economies. Are we still waiting for the full Brexit effect? Kamal Ahmed, BBC News, Reading.
The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn says his MPs will face a three-line whip compelling them to vote to trigger Article 50, allowing the start of Brexit negotiations. That's prompted one shadow minister to quit the front bench in protest. A two-line bill on the issue entered the Commons today, with the vote expected next week. Our deputy political editor John Pienaar is at Westminster for us tonight. So John, first of all, what's in this bill and is it likely to get through Parliament?
Yes, it is. Theresa May hoped, of course, to get Brexit started without getting an OK from Parliament. But the Supreme Court said she must, so we have this. A piece of law so brief you could write it on the back of an envelope and have room to spare. And it very simply gives Theresa May authority to get the negotiations to leave going and then take it from there. Will it pass? It will pass comfortably by the look of things, because most MPs have simply decided they can't defy the EU referendum. And Jeremy Corbyn has told his MPs, some of them reluctant, some of them outright rebellious, they can try to influence the outcome, but they can't stop Brexit.
But how tricky is it going to prove for Mr Corbyn? He's already seen one resignation today.
It's very difficult for Labour. The Tories were always the party with a running schism over Europe, and now it's Labour's turn, because so many Labour members and MPs come from areas that voted to leave. Today, Jeremy Corbyn has persuaded some of his unhappy shadow ministers to go along with this and vote with the government on this bill, but one of them, Tulip Siddiq, has resigned. Others will vote against this too. He'll have to decide whether to sack them. At the end of the day, it leaves Labour split on tactics and policy, and ministers now confident of getting at least to the starting line of this marathon over an obstacle course towards Brexit.
OK, John, at Westminster, thank you. There's been a record rise in suicides, assaults and self-harm inside prisons in England and Wales, and the latest figures are a stark reminder of the crisis in the penal system. There were 354 deaths in prison custody last year. More than 100 were suicides. Nearly 6,500 staff were assaulted in the year to last September. That's a 40% increase. And incidents of self-harm are up by nearly a quarter. Our Home Affairs correspondent June Kelly has been speaking to one prison officer about life inside the prison walls.
Life in our jails is getting worse for staff and prisoners. The rise in assaults, suicides and self-harming is relentless.
Man, a riot in HMP Birmingham.
The sense of crisis in the system was underlined by a riot in Birmingham prison, where inmates posed in helmets stolen from staff. Just one of a string of jail disturbances in recent months. Amid the volatile atmosphere, today's figures show that in the past year, a record number of prisoners have taken their own lives.
It's very hard when you've got members of your family who...
Sarah is a long-serving prison officer whose identity we are protecting. She describes having to deal with a teenage suicide.
A self-inflicted death is an horrific experience. You feel, is there something more I could have done? I was only 19. I came on duty, I went to perform a roll check, I lifted the flap, and this young man was suspended in his cell. He'd hung himself overnight. We lay him on the bed, and I saw a note to his sister on the side, and I saw it was his birthday, and I thought, what a waste. That will stay with me.
Just describe the thoughts in your head as you're going into work.
I go into work feeling anxious, tensions are high, prisoners are angry and frustrated. When you open the door, you don't know what you're going to be faced with. I've had everything from urine, faeces, televisions thrown at me.
Spice in a jailhouse.
Prisons are awash with drugs and psychoactive substances which are meant to be banned, all adding to the underlying problems of staff shortages and overcrowding. Vulnerable prisoners are suffering in the increasingly threatening environment in some jails.
Well, I'm very clear that the levels of violence in our prisons are too high and the levels of self-harm are too high. Since I became Justice Secretary, I've focused on dealing with this problem. That's why we're investing an extra £100 million, 2,500 extra prison officers across the estate, so that we're able to have a caseload of one prison officer for every 6 prisoners.
But Sarah says the challenge is not recruiting staff, it's retaining them.
It's like a soldier on a battlefield. You don't know what you're going to be faced with. And on top of that, you've got the fear. Am I going to make it home tonight? I've never been in fear of my life until now, and we just don't get paid enough to have that fear every day.
June Kelly, BBC News.
And there's a lot more detail about the pressures on the prison system on our website. You can find it at bbc.co.uk/prisons. Tan Diel, the former Labour MP for West Lothian, has died after a short illness. He was 84. He'll be remembered for his persistent questioning of Margaret Thatcher over the sinking of the General Belgrano during the Falklands War and his campaigning against other conflicts. His family said he had devoted his life to public service. Tomorrow is Holocaust Memorial Day, marking the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz at the end of the Second World War. Commemorations are being held there to remember the 6 million Jews and others that were murdered by the Nazis. Our special correspondent Anna Little has been to Auschwitz and met one woman who survived her time there against the odds.
72 years ago this week, Soviet troops entered Auschwitz. This was not the only extermination camp in Nazi-occupied Europe, but it was where the evidence was best preserved of the crime that came to be known as the Holocaust. On this railway platform, Nazi officers separated those chosen to live and work from those sent immediately to die. These pictures show Jews transported here from Hungary in 1944. Susan Pollock, 13 years old, was chosen to live. Her mother was sent to the gas.
There was no hugs, there was no kisses, there was no embrace. The dehumanization started immediately. I didn't cry. It was just as if I had lost all my feelings. And there was Auschwitz.
This was not a German crime alone. These railway lines extended to almost every corner of Europe and to the active collaboration of Norwegian civil servants, French police, Polish train drivers, Ukrainian paramilitaries. When it was over, a great public silence descended on Europe.
After the war, the nations of Europe were so preoccupied by their own victimhood that they didn't pay much attention to the uniqueness of what had happened here. The Jews who survived found that the world beyond these perimeter fences didn't much want to hear their stories. It was only really in the 1960s, nearly 20 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, that popular consciousness in the world began to confront what Europe collectively had done to its Jews.
But international law changed immediately. At the post-war Nuremberg trials, 2 new crimes entered the judicial lexicon for the first time: crimes against humanity and genocide.
Before 1945, if a state wished to kill half its population, there was no rule of international law that said you couldn't do that. Now, the change that occurred in 1945, as we know very sadly, has not prevented horrors from taking place. But it does mean that when horrors occur, there is now at least an objective standard which says to governments, to individual states, that as a matter of international law, you cannot do what you are doing.
It took half a century for those powers to be used, but dozens have been convicted and jailed by international courts for genocide and crimes against humanity in Bosnia, Rwanda and elsewhere. Even so, Holocaust denial persists. The internet is full of claims that the destruction of the Jews never happened. But the testimony of survivors is a warning to posterity, to us, here, today.
We're not talking about barbarian, we're not talking about primitive society. The Germans were advanced, educated, progressive amongst the European nations. Maybe the civilization is just veneer thin. I think we all need to be very careful about any hate propaganda, because it has got the potential to erupt. And then it's too late to stop it.
Alan Little, BBC News, Auschwitz.
Now, it's considered to be one of the leading international prizes for contemporary art. Held every 2 years, Artes Mundi was founded in 2002. And within the past hour, the winner of the 40,000 prize has been announced at a ceremony in Cardiff. The celebrated British artist and filmmaker John Acumphrah was chosen from a shortlist of 6. And he's been speaking to our arts editor, Will Gompertz.
Here is the winner of the 2017 Artes Mundi. It is a film, but not of the Oscar-winning variety. It's more a series of vignettes reflecting on the harrowing nature of forced migration. is by the Ghanaian-born, London-based artist John Akomfrah, whose own family were forced to flee persecution and, like millions today, experience what it can feel like to move to another country.
Imagine this, if you're a child of migrants, you sort of live with this. And if you've lived for as long as I have, you've heard this for a while. You know, I remember this conversation in the 60s.
Which conversation?
Conversations about whether or not there were too many of you here, the numbers of you.
It's such a tragic topic, and then when you pull it into art, you give it this sort of sheen of beauty. Does that concern you?
Yes and no. I don't always do things which are beautiful, but I mean, I don't shun it just because the subject's tough. In fact, that's the reason why you bring to bear certain formal questions, to think about ways in which you can make something which feels to people outside of it like, oh God, I wouldn't touch that, oh, I wouldn't watch that. You know, as a sort of prelude, a kind of an invitation.
Other artists taking part in the prize include the French-Algerian Neil Baloufa and American Amy Franceschini. Among the judges was a curator deemed by one publication to be the most powerful person in the art world, where I asked, does she think this prize fits into a landscape already teeming with awards?
I think Artis Mundi is very important for the UK, because the awards you have in the UK are national. For example, the Turner Prize. It's for British artists or British-based artists. So what the UK didn't really have in a very eminent way was an international prize. So I think it fills a gap, an important gap.
The judges said they awarded the prize to John Akomfrah for the way in which his work explores migration, racism and persecution. To speak of these things at this moment, they said, feels more important than ever. Will Gompertz, BBC News, Cardiff.
Well, Newsnight is getting underway over on BBC Two. Here's Kirsty.
Tonight, Theresa May is in the US getting ready to forge a new relationship with the leader of the free world. So does she put trade first and leave the ticking off until later? And we revisit train spotting on the eve of the long-awaited sequel. Join me now on BBC Two.
You're on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Bye-bye.